The afternoon Vic Calloway stopped for gas in Meridian, Mississippi. He wasn't looking for trouble. He'd been on the road since before sunrise, riding south on I-20 toward Hattiesburg for a weekend chapter, gathering with the Ironwood Riders MC. And all he wanted was a full tank, a cold bottle of water, and maybe a few minutes out of the heat before pushing the last 90 miles. He was 53 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a gray-streaked beard he'd been growing since his second tour overseas, and a leather vest that had seen more miles than most people drove in a decade. The patches on that vest told the story of a life that hadn't always been easy, but had always been deliberate. Iron Cross veteran pin on the left chest, American flag rocker on the right shoulder, a small enamel badge from the Alabama Sheriff's Association that he'd been allowed to keep when he retired, a courtesy extended to men who'd given the better part of their working lives to a county that sometimes forgot to say thank you. His road name was Preacher, a name earned not from religion, but from the way he talked sense into people when everything around them was falling apart. Brothers who'd seen him talk a suicidal veteran off a highway overpass at 2 a.m, brothers who'd watched him sit with a grieving widow for 3 hours after a club funeral, brothers who'd heard him de-escalate a bar fight with 4 sentences and a steady voice. They were the ones who'd pinned that name on him at a campfire in Tennessee 8 years ago. He'd worn it ever since, without argument. He'd been a sheriff's deputy for 22 years in northern Alabama before his knees gave out, and the department offered him a desk he wasn't willing to sit behind. He'd worked patrol, missing persons, and a 2-year stint with a regional task force on crimes against children that had left marks on him that didn't show from the outside, but informed everything he saw when he looked at the world. He knew what fear looked like on small faces. He knew the particular stillness of a child who had been taught, through pain or threat, to make themselves invisible. He knew the difference between a kid who was bored and a kid who was surviving. It was not a skill he'd asked for. It was a skill that had been pressed into him by years of cases that ended in courtrooms and cases that didn't end at all, and it lived in him now the way all the worst knowledge lived, quietly, constantly, always on. The EZ Mart on Highway 80 sat at the edge of a commercial strip that had seen better decades, a check-cashing place with bars on the windows, a dollar store with a hand-painted sandwich board out front, a closed-down diner with plywood over its windows, and a faded menu still visible through the boards, advertising chicken fried steak and a slice of pie for $8, a price that probably hadn't been accurate since before the recession. The gas station itself was clean enough, the pumps modern, a hand-lettered sign in the window advertising sweet tea for $1. It was the kind of place that served the people who lived there, not tourists, not highway travelers looking for an experience, just working people filling their tanks and buying their lunches and getting back to whatever came next. Vic liked places like that. They reminded him of where he'd come from. He pulled his Road King up to the pump farthest from the entrance, backed it in out of habit, and swiped his card. While the tank filled, he watched the parking lot the way he always watched parking lots, not with suspicion exactly, but with the low, idle awareness that came from 22 years of knowing that nothing was ever entirely neutral. There were 4 cars at the pumps, a minivan with Georgia plates and a family of 5 reorganizing their luggage, 2 kids chasing each other around the back bumper while their parents argued quietly about something on a phone screen. An older pickup with a cracked windshield, and a man in his 50s pumping gas while talking on his phone, one boot propped on the running board, looking like a man who had nowhere urgent to be. A silver sedan at pump 2 with the nozzle in, but no one visibly pumping, which was the kind of thing that was sometimes nothing and sometimes worth remembering. And near the entrance, a red hatchback with Mississippi plates and its engine still running, which was the kind of thing that sometimes meant a quick restroom stop and sometimes meant something else entirely. Vic replaced the nozzle, capped his tank, and decided he'd go inside for that water. The automatic doors slid open, and he felt the cool rush of air conditioning settle over him as he stepped into the store. The layout was standard, drinks along the back wall, 4 cooler doors spanning the full width, snacks on 3 short aisles running parallel to the entrance, a rack of sunglasses no serious person would buy, lottery tickets, cigarettes, and phone chargers behind the register. A small television mounted high in the corner, muted, showing a weather map. It was the kind of interior Vic had walked into 1,000 times over the years, in 1,000 towns that all looked roughly like this one, and he noticed it the way he noticed all of them, completely, immediately, and without appearing to look at anything in particular. The clerk was a young woman, maybe 24 or 25, with her dark hair pulled back tight and a name tag on her blue company shirt that he couldn't quite read from where he stood. She was ringing up a transaction for the man standing at the counter, a heavy-set white male in his late 30s with a sun-faded red baseball cap, khaki shorts, and a short-sleeved buttoned shirt printed with a tropical pattern that suggested someone had put deliberate effort into looking unremarkable. He had the build of someone who'd been athletic once and hadn't been recently. His posture at the counter was relaxed in the specific way of someone who practiced appearing relaxed. He was paying cash, which wasn't unusual, and he was talking to the clerk with the easy, surface-level friendliness of a man who wanted to be remembered as pleasant and forgettable at the same time. Behind the man, standing close but not next to him, separated by about 18 inches of deliberate distance, was a girl. 12 years old, maybe 13, though something about the way she held herself made her seem younger. Slim, with light brown hair pulled into a low ponytail that had mostly come loose, and a pale blue t-shirt with a small logo on the chest that Vic couldn't make out. She had the look of someone who had been given a specific instruction about how to stand and was following it with the careful precision of a child who had learned that not following instructions had consequences. Her hands were at her sides, fingers slightly curled. Her chin was angled down about 10 degrees from level, and her eyes, when they moved at all, moved in the short, deliberate sweeps of someone cataloging the room without appearing to look at anything, the eyes of a person who needed to know where everything was without letting anyone know they needed to know. Vic moved toward the drink coolers at an angle that brought him into the girl's peripheral vision without bringing him into the man's direct line of sight. He pulled open the cooler door and reached for a water bottle with the unhurried ease of a man who had nowhere to be, and in that same moment, he saw the girl's head turn by approximately 2 inches in the direction of the clerk. It was barely a movement, less than a movement, more like a change in the orientation of her attention, a gravitational shift so small that anyone not looking for it would have registered nothing. And then, in the space between one breath and the next, the girl gave a single, slow, sideways shake of her head, not at Vic, not at the room, not at the KE, directly at the clerk behind the counter. One slow, deliberate shake, the kind that was trying to be completely invisible, the kind that said no without saying anything. Vic had spent 22 years learning the language that people spoke when they couldn't speak. He had seen it in the faces of domestic violence victims who stood beside their abusers in his patrol car's headlights and said everything was fine while their eyes said the opposite. He had seen it in the trembling stillness of children removed from homes where the word fine had become the most dangerous word in the English language. He had seen it in interrogation rooms and on highway shoulders and in hospital waiting rooms, the vocabulary of people who needed help but existed in a situation where asking out loud was not safe. He knew every dialect of that language, and what he had just seen was a sentence, clear and complete, spoken in the most dangerous dialect of all. He looked at the clerk without appearing to look at her. She was completing the transaction with her face arranged into the careful neutral of someone managing something she could not allow to surface. Her voice was steady. Her movements were efficient. Everything about her performance was professional. But her hands, when they moved across the register keypad, moved with the slight extra deliberateness of someone who was thinking very carefully about what each finger was doing. She hit a sequence of buttons, and one of those buttons, hit with the side of her index finger in a motion that lasted less than half a second, was not in the sequence a standard transaction required. It was lower on the pad, off to the left of where her hand needed to be, the kind of reach that exists on a register for one specific purpose that has nothing to do with processing a sale. Her expression didn't change. The man in the baseball cap collected his change and didn't look at her hands. But the girl, standing 18 inches behind him, let her eyes drop to the floor for exactly the duration of one slow exhale. And what crossed her face in that fraction of a second was the specific, desperate relief of someone who had been waiting for something to happen and had just seen the first evidence that it might. Vic set his water bottle on the shelf behind him quietly and took his phone from his vest pocket with the unhurried ease of a man checking a message. He typed nothing. He scrolled nothing. He held the phone in a way that justified his eyes being directed at it rather than at the counter. And he moved himself, gradually, with the casual drift of a man deciding between chip flavors, to a position just inside the entrance, 4 feet from the door, in a spot that would not obstruct anything obviously, but that placed him between the man at the counter and the parking lot in a way that would matter if movement happened quickly. 22 years in law enforcement had taught him that the most important real estate in any developing situation was not the location of the threat. It was the space between the threat and the exit. Control that space, and you controlled the situation. Lose that space, and you were always reacting instead of acting. He had no badge. He had no authority. He had a retired deputy's read on a situation that had not yet crossed any visible line, and he had the memory of a young girl's single sideways headshake and the look on her face when the clerk's finger found that button. Those two things together were enough. They had always been enough. The man at the counter pocketed his change, said something to the clerk in a tone too low for Vic to catch, and turned toward the door. His eyes swept the store once, passed over Vic without pausing, and settled on the girl. He said it was time to go in the flat, patient tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed who was making an effort to sound reasonable. The girl moved toward the door without looking up. As she passed within 6 feet of where Vic stood, she turned her head for less than a second and looked directly at him. Not at the door, not at the floor, at him. And in that look was everything she hadn't been able to say out loud since whatever moment had brought her to this gas station with this man on this Tuesday afternoon. It was not a look of hope. It was the look of someone who had done the only thing available to them and was waiting, with the practiced stillness of a child who had learned to wait, to find out if it had been enough. Vic let them walk past him. He waited until the automatic door had closed behind them. Then he looked at the clerk. She was already looking at him, her hands flat on the counter, her composure intact in the surface way of someone who had not yet allowed themselves to feel what they were feeling. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. He gave a single slow nod. She closed her eyes briefly and nodded back. Then Vic walked out into the Mississippi heat. The red hatchback was 30 feet away. The man had his hand on the passenger door handle, and the girl was standing at the open door with her arms at her sides and her chin down, and she was not getting in. It was a small thing, that stillness, that refusal to lift her foot and step up into the seat, but Vic recognized it for what it was. It was the last available resistance of a child who had no other options left. She couldn't run. She couldn't shout. She couldn't do anything that would work, but she could stand there for 3 more seconds and not get in the car, and that was what she was doing. The man said something to her in a low voice. She didn't move. He said it again with the particular edge that crept into a controlled person's voice when the control started costing them more than they'd budgeted. His hand came off the door handle and moved toward her shoulder. And that was when Vic crossed the remaining distance between them and said, in the voice he'd used for 22 years when voices needed to carry without needing to be raised, that he'd appreciate it if everyone stayed right where they were for just a minute. The man turned. His face did the thing that faces did when an unexpected variable appeared, a fast recalibration, a decision being made behind the eyes about how to respond. He chose friendly. He smiled the smile of a man who had nothing to hide and was mildly amused by the suggestion that he might. He said he didn't know what this was about, but they were just leaving. Vic said he understood that and he wasn't trying to make anyone's day difficult, but he'd noticed the young lady seemed a little uncomfortable, and he just wanted to make sure everything was all right before they headed out. Simple as that. The man's smile held, but his eyes changed. Something shifted behind them, a sharpening, an assessment. He was looking at Vic the way people looked at obstacles, measuring distance, measuring weight, measuring the probability that this particular obstacle could be managed. He said the girl was his daughter and she was fine, just tired from the drive. And he'd appreciate it if Vic would mind his own business. Vic said he certainly would, and he was sorry to bother them. But since they were all just standing here anyway, he wondered if the young lady could tell him herself that she was all right. He looked at the girl when he said it, not at the man. The girl's eyes came up from the pavement for the first time since they'd walked out of the store. She looked at Vic with the careful, measuring look of someone who had been disappointed before by people who seemed like they were going to help and then didn't. Someone who had learned not to spend hope carelessly because she didn't have unlimited reserves of it. She looked at him for 2 full seconds, and then she said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but that was steady in the way that certain kinds of courage were steady, that she didn't know this man, that his name wasn't her dad, that she didn't know where her dad was and she wanted to go home. The man moved fast for someone his size. He stepped sideways toward the driver's door with the specific efficiency of someone executing a plan, not reacting to a situation, but moving to the next step of something already decided. Vic had been expecting exactly that. He'd positioned himself 10 feet from the rear bumper during the conversation, close enough to matter, far enough to give himself options, and when the man moved, he was already moving, not toward the man, but toward the front of the car, placing himself between the hatchback's hood and the pump island in a way that made driving forward impossible without hitting him. He put his phone to his ear as he moved and told the 911 dispatcher, who had been on the line for the past 4 minutes listening to everything, that the situation had escalated and he needed units at the EZ Mart on Highway 80 right now. The man stopped at the driver's door. His hand was on the handle. He looked at Vic standing in front of his car and did the calculation that Vic had watched people do 100 times in parking lots and driveways and highway shoulders, the calculation of whether the man in front of them was serious, whether he was alone, whether the cost of going through him was worth what waited on the other side. Behind Vic, the girl had not moved. She was still standing at the open passenger door, but she was no longer looking at the pavement. She was watching. The man let go of the door handle. He raised both hands, slowly, in the gesture of someone choosing to appear reasonable rather than being reasonable, and he said again calmly that this was a misunderstanding, that the girl was confused, that she had behavioral issues, and sometimes said things that weren't accurate. Vic said he heard him, and he was sure they could get everything sorted out, but the way to get it sorted out was to wait right here for a couple of minutes until the officers arrived, because they were already on their way, and there was nothing left to do but wait. The man looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the girl. Something passed between them in that look, something that had history in it, weight in it, the kind of communication that develops over time between a person who holds power and a person who lives inside it. The girl's chin went back down, her shoulders pulled in slightly, and Vic stepped closer, not toward the man, but toward the girl, putting himself between her and that look, because sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply interrupt the line of sight between a child and whatever had been teaching her to make herself small. He heard the sirens before he saw the lights. 2 Lauderdale County Sheriff's units came off Highway 80 into the lot within 30 seconds of each other, moving fast, and a Meridian City police cruiser came in from the service road on the far side, maybe 40 seconds after that. 3 units responding to a silent alarm with a civilian on the line confirming active development. Vic kept his hands visible as they pulled in. He'd been on the other side of a responding unit enough times to know that the arriving officer's first job was to figure out who the threat was, and a large man in a motorcycle vest standing in front of a vehicle was not an obvious read. The first deputy out of his cruiser was a young man, maybe 28, moving with the controlled urgency of someone well-trained and paying attention. Vic identified himself immediately. "Retired Limestone County Sheriff's Deputy Victor Calloway," he said. "Ironwood Riders M.C. I'm the one who called this in. The man by the driver's door is the subject. The girl at the passenger door does not know him and has stated so verbally." The deputy took it in fast, gave Vic a nod that meant stay there and stay visible, and moved toward the man by the driver's door with his partner flanking wide. The second unit's deputy went directly to the girl. He crouched down to her level the way good officers learn to do, making himself smaller rather than larger, taking the authority out of his posture and replacing it with something quieter. Vic couldn't hear what he said to her. He could see her face. He watched the moment when whatever the deputy said reached her, watched the thing that had been holding her together since God knows when begin, very slowly, to loosen. She didn't cry immediately. She stood there for another few seconds with her arms wrapped around herself and her face working through something complicated and private. And then she sat down on the edge of the open passenger doorframe and put her face in her hands, and her shoulders began to shake. The man by the driver's door was not cooperating, which surprised no one. He was explaining loudly about misunderstandings and false accusations and his legal rights, which was the standard script of someone who had run this play before and trusted it. The deputy listened with the specific patience of someone who had heard this script before and was waiting for it to finish so the actual work could begin. His partner had already run the plates. Vic saw the partner step back and speak quietly into his radio with an expression that said the plates had returned something worth knowing. It took 11 minutes from the first unit's arrival for the picture to clarify enough to matter. The vehicle was registered to a shell address in Tennessee that did not correspond to any residential property. The man's identification was real, but flagged in a national database maintained by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in connection with an investigation out of Memphis that had been open for 14 months. And the girl, whose name was Danny, who was 11 years old, who had light brown hair, mostly loose from a ponytail, and a pale blue t-shirt with a small butterfly on the chest, had been reported missing from her grandmother's home in Tupelo, Mississippi, 9 days ago. 9 days. Vic stood at the edge of the parking lot and felt the numbers settle into him the way those numbers always settled, with the particular weight of everything that 9 days could contain. He'd worked enough cases to know what 9 days meant. He'd worked enough cases to know what it meant that she was still here, still intact, still capable of standing at an open car door and refusing to get in for 3 more seconds while she waited to find out if the man by the motorcycle was going to be different from all the others who hadn't been. The Lauderdale County detective who arrived 20 minutes later was a woman named Sergeant Patricia Odom, 15 years on the job, with the kind of face that had learned to stay neutral through anything, and the kind of eyes that noticed everything anyway. She took Vic's statement in full, asked precise questions, and wrote everything down in a small notebook with a methodical thoroughness he respected. When he finished, she looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone making an assessment. She said that the clerk's alarm and his position at the exit had prevented the subject from leaving the premises before units arrived, and that given the subject's history and the nature of the network the Memphis investigation had been working, the probability that Danny would have been located through conventional means within any meaningful time frame was not high. She said it the way people with 15 years of that work said things that were true but hard, which was directly and without decoration. Vic asked how Danny was doing. Odom said she was with a victim advocate who had arrived from the county office, that she had been medically cleared at the scene, and that her grandmother was driving down from Tupelo and would be there within 2 hours. She said Danny had asked twice about the biker who had stood in front of the car. She said the girl had wanted to know if he was still there. He was still there. He'd been leaning against his Road King at the edge of the lot, staying out of the way of the official work, drinking the water bottle he'd never paid for, and making a mental note to go back in and settle that before he left. When the victim advocate, a soft-spoken woman named Ms. Treadwell, brought Danny over to him, the girl walked with the careful, slightly disconnected gait of someone who was still processing the fact that the immediate danger was over. She stopped a few feet away from him and looked at his vest for a moment, at the patches, at the worn leather, at the American flag on the shoulder. Then she looked up at his face. She said she'd shaken her head at the clerk because the man had told her not to talk to anyone, but he hadn't said anything about not moving her head. She said she'd been looking for someone to tell since the 3rd day, but the places they'd stopped had always been too fast, too crowded, or the man had stayed too close. She said when she'd seen him walk into the store, she'd thought he looked like someone who might not look away. She didn't say it like a compliment exactly. She said it like a fact she had identified and acted on, the way a child who had been surviving on instinct for 9 days learned to identify and act on facts. Vic told her she had been exactly right to trust that instinct. He told her she had done everything correctly, that the headshake had been smart and brave, that staying still at the car door had bought the time that needed buying. He told her that her grandmother was on her way and would be there soon. Danny nodded. She looked at his vest again and asked about the patch from the Sheriff's Association. He explained it briefly. She thought about that for a moment, and then said it made sense, that he'd seemed like someone who knew what he was doing. He almost smiled. He told her that she'd seemed like someone who knew what she was doing, too. Her grandmother arrived at 4:47 in the afternoon, driving a green Buick that she'd clearly pushed harder than its age recommended, parking it crooked across two spaces without appearing to notice or care. She was a small woman in her 60s, with gray hair and Danny's same light brown eyes, and she covered the distance between the car and her granddaughter in the particular way of someone who had been traveling toward a person for 2 hours and was finally almost there. Danny met her halfway. They held each other in the middle of the parking lot while the sheriff's deputies and the detective and the victim advocate and the gas station clerk who had come outside stood at various distances and found things to look at that weren't the reunion, because some moments were too private to witness directly. Vic looked anyway. He'd learned long ago that looking away from reunions was a luxury he didn't allow himself. He'd worked too many cases that didn't have them. The grandmother came to him afterward with Danny's hand in hers and said things that Vic received with the quiet discomfort of a man who had never known how to accept gratitude for doing what seemed obvious. He said the clerk deserved the credit, that what she'd done behind that counter required steadiness he genuinely admired. He said Danny deserved the credit, that 9 days of surviving and one perfect moment of calculated courage under impossible pressure was not something that could be overstated. The grandmother gripped his hand for a long moment without saying anything else. Sometimes that was the most complete thing there was to say. He went back inside and paid for the water. The clerk, whose name tag he could finally read, said Janelle, was back behind the counter with the careful composure of someone who had just used every resource available to her and was still standing. He put a 20 on the counter and told her to keep the change. She shook her head and gave him back $19. He told her she was the reason any of it had worked. She looked at him for a moment and then nodded once, accepting that, and went back to the business of her shift. The Ironwood Riders' MC charter in Hattiesburg heard the full story that weekend around a fire behind the chapter house, and by the following month the club had reached out to the EZ Mart corporate office to formally recognize Janelle's actions, a recognition that eventually included a commendation from the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Office as well. The chapter started running an informal awareness program at their community events, talking about what silent alarm systems were, how clerks used them, and what bystanders could do if they paid attention to the space around a register rather than just the transaction happening at it. It was not a formal program. It was just men who had seen something and believed that the most useful thing they could do with what they'd seen was make sure other people could see it too. Danny went back to Tupelo with her grandmother. She started seeing a counselor through a victim services program and, according to what Sergeant Odom passed along to Vic 3 months later, was doing the hard, non-linear work of healing that didn't move in straight lines, but moved nonetheless. Her grandmother sent a card to the Hattiesburg chapter address that Vic had left with Odom, a plain card with a small printed flower on the front. Inside, in the careful handwriting of a woman who chose her words with intention, it said that her granddaughter had told her what she'd done in that store, the headshake, the waiting, the refusal to get in the car, and that she wanted whoever had stood in front of that vehicle to know that her granddaughter was the bravest person she had ever met in her 63 years, and that she thanked God every day for the people who had been paying attention. Vic kept the card in the inside pocket of his vest, behind the patch from the Alabama Sheriff's Association, next to a folded photograph of his unit from the second deployment that he'd carried for 30 years. He was not a man given to explaining the things he kept close. But if someone had asked him why that particular card was in that particular pocket, he would have said something simple. That paying attention was not a talent. It was a decision. That it had to be made fresh every day, in every parking lot, in every store, and every ordinary place where ordinary things were supposed to happen. That the cost of making it was low, and the cost of not making it was something he had watched families pay for 22 years and could not afford to stop thinking about. That sometimes a single slow headshake from a child who had nothing left but that one small motion was all the information anyone needed, and that the only question that mattered was whether you were paying close enough attention to see it.